Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the National Biodiversity Teach-In. Today is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science, and up next we have Patricia Yager, and she's going to be talking to us today about climate science. Thank you very much, Patricia, for joining us today.
Thanks, Frankie. It's great to be here. I really, of course, here's my cat. Right on time.
I had that issue as well.
It's great to be here. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. So I guess I'll start right away. I understand that today is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So my first slide will be a little bit about all the amazing women that I have worked with in my career. I had an amazing dissertation advisor, Jody Deming, who I don't have a picture of, unfortunately. But since then, I've worked with all sorts of amazing women across the world who have supported me and collaborated with me. And so I just wanted you all to know that there are a lot of great women scientists out there, and we encourage all of you to join us. One of my favorite women in science is Lolly. Lolly Garai is a teacher in the Houston area, and she came along, a K-12 teacher, and she came along through the Polar Trek program as part of the NSF-funded projects that we do, and really contributed quite a lot and helped me learn better how to communicate with K-12 students. So I always have to honor her and her contribution. And if you all know any teachers who are amazing teachers who might be interested in the Polar Trek program, you should definitely let them know about it. So a little bit about me. I'm an oceanographer, and I have worked in all these places where you see green triangles. I worked a lot in the Arctic Ocean, and then also in the Antarctic Ocean. But I also discovered that climate change is having an impact on the tropical regions, and I've done a lot of work in the Amazon River. Maybe you heard about the fact that we discovered a coral reef near the mouth of the Amazon River a couple of years ago. That was a big deal. So biodiversity is being impacted all over the world by climate change. This is how we usually go to sea, how we do our work. We get on big ships, which takes a lot of organization and a lot of logistics, but is also kind of fun. You live on a ship like this for a couple of months with maybe 40 other scientists, and you all work together. It's a little like summer camp, where you really get to know each other very, very well, and you all become kind of best friends for a few months while you're working together. And, of course, surrounded by these beautiful scenery. This is the kind of work we do. These are the sampling bottles we send over the side into the ocean to collect water and animals. We also use nets and other kinds of instruments to collect samples. And then, of course, lots of photography and looking out at the scenery, but also the animals around the ice where we work. And sometimes we go out on a little boat. And this is inside the ship. It's kind of like I don't know, it's like a school maybe, lots of desks and chairs and computers and places for counting and looking at microscopes and such like that. It's pretty cozy. So why are we here? I'm supposed to tell you a little bit about climate change. I'm guessing that you know as much about climate change as more than most people would be my guess, since you're probably getting a great education. But I'll just fill you in just a little bit in case you aren't clear on what climate change is. So climate change is being caused by the combustion of what's called fossil fuels. So oil and gas that we dig out of the ground that's been buried for thousands, if not millions of years, and we bring it up to the surface and we use it to make energy. And the exhaust from burning that gas is going up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and other compounds, but carbon dioxide's the big one. And when the carbon dioxide, and this is a curve of how much we've been putting up in the atmosphere over the last 100 or so years, and it's a lot. And even though CO2 in the atmosphere is a small amount, it does affect what's called the greenhouse effect, or the radiation budget. So incoming sunshine bounces around inside of our atmosphere a little bit and re-radiates back to the Earth if it can't escape out to space. And so the CO2 is in the atmosphere that's on the rise is causing more and more heat to rebounce back to the Earth's surface and warm us up. And so if you add up all that extra energy that we've been collecting in the earth because of this greenhouse effect, it's about 10 to the 25th power joules. Now, you probably don't know joules, and I don't really know joules either, but so I converted it into calories because most of us think about calories when we eat a piece of chocolate cake, for example. So this number of joules converts into a trillion calories. That's a lot of extra calories that our planet has absorbed because of this greenhouse effect, and it's causing problems. It's causing extra heat to stay in our Earth. And what we see is that most of the heat is in the ocean, not in the atmosphere. We talk about the warming of the atmosphere quite a bit, but a lot of the heat, in fact, 93% of it, of this extra heat that we have absorbed because of the greenhouse effect, has gone into the ocean. So the oceans are warming a lot. If you look at a global distribution, this is the distribution of the extra heat in the atmosphere. And this is a distribution of the extra heat that's gone into the ocean. And what you might notice is that there's something going on called polar amplification. And that's a big word, but it means that things are happening to a greater extent. Warming is happening to a greater extent in the very high latitudes like the Arctic. This particular graph doesn't have any Antarctic on it, but I can tell you that the Antarctic is also warming. So I'm going to tell you about climate change's impacts on the Arctic and the Antarctic ecosystems, because this is supposed to be about biodiversity. And these are two places where there are animals that live here and only here. And so if we lose these ecosystems, we're going to lose some significant biodiversity of our planet. And just to remind you, the Arctic is different from the Antarctic. That's probably you know this, but if you don't, the Arctic is in the northern hemisphere. This is the United States, and this is Siberia and Europe. And the Arctic is where the polar bears live. The Antarctic is on the other side of the Earth at the South Pole, and that's where the penguins live. And interesting thing that makes them different is that the Arctic is an ocean and it's covered by white stuff, but this white stuff is called sea ice, and it's not very thick. It's only a few feet thick, whereas Antarctic is a continent that's full of very, very, very thick glaciers and is surrounded by a ring of sea ice. The only glacial ice in the Arctic is in Greenland and on a few of the Canadian archipelago islands up here in northern Canada. And so the Arctic is an ocean covered with sea ice, and the Antarctic is a continent surrounded by sea ice. So again, the common theme here is ice, and you all know what ice does when it gets warm, right? It starts to melt. But let's first talk about not all ice is the same. This is just to show you there's glacial ice, the blue stuff on land, and it looks really thick and heavy. It's what makes icebergs when it breaks off. Usually the ice is formed from snow that falls and then gets compressed into a glacier, and that glacier slowly flows, because even though ice looks like it's solid, it's actually, it can flow like a liquid. And it flows down to the ocean where it makes an ice shelf. And this is actually a picture of an ice shelf. So you can see that they're pretty thick. They're many hundreds of feet thick. And that's what calves off icebergs. So you've probably seen pictures of icebergs. The other kind of ice in these polar regions is what I mentioned a minute ago, ice, which is only a couple of feet, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 feet thick. And it has snow on top usually. And that's where the animals live. And it floats on the water just like an ice cube would float in your drink. In the middle is this area of open ocean called a Pallinha. Pallinha is a Russian word, I think, that means pool. It's an area of open water surrounded by ice. And these Pallinhas, I'll tell you about more in a few minutes, very, very productive biologically. They attract a lot of wildlife because there's good food there, there's a place to breathe. Things like that. So they're very important biologically. So here again is another picture of sea ice. There's some orca whales. Probably you're all far away, too far from the screen, you can't see them, but there's a seal happily sitting on the sea ice. And then the orca whales that are limited to being in the ocean are waiting for that seal to decide to go for a swim. And of course, it's not going to do that because it can see them. But the sea ice is a place for lots of animals to haul out for safety. So what's going on with the sea ice that's important to the ecosystem is the sea ice reflects a lot of solar energy away back into space. And if you can think about maybe what kinds of clothes you choose on a hot summer day versus a cool, sunny winter day, I like to wear black a lot. But if I wear black in Georgia in the summertime, I get kind of hot. So usually I try to wear white t-shirts in the summertime in Georgia because they keep me cool, because the white reflects back the sunshine and reflects back the heat, compared to a black t-shirt that absorbs the heat. And so if you think about a picture of the Arctic from space, the ocean from space looks very dark. The sea ice, of course, looks very light. And so when sea ice is present, it reflects that heat, that sunshine back into space and keeps the Arctic cool. Once a little bit of ice starts to melt, more and more dark ocean gets exposed and it absorbs heat. And so as we melt a little bit of sea ice, we start to melt a lot of sea ice. But the sea ice itself is really critical habitat for lots of life. This is looking at a diver underneath some sea ice. This is something called Melisira, which is a colonial diatom. It's a phytoplankton that makes long chains. That greenish color is the chlorophyll of the diatom, along with some other pigments. And it hangs underneath the ice. The sunlight can penetrate through ice pretty well, as long as there's not a lot of snow on top of it. So the algae live underneath. They attach themselves to the bottom of the ice and hang down into the water. Or sometimes they live actually inside the ice. This is a piece of ice that's turned over, and you can see the brown diatoms on the lower edge of the ice. And inside the ice itself are all these little pockets and brine. They're called brine channels, and all kinds of things live in sea ice, feeding on that algae. There's worms and crustaceans and lots of bacteria and all kinds of interesting life, ciliates and flagellates and things like that live in the brine pockets of the sea ice. So it really is a critical habitat for life. And it's also the support for lots of other things. Here's another picture. This is what diatoms look like under the microscope. Again, I'm on the bow of a ship, and this piece of ice has turned upside down as the ship went by, and revealing the sea ice algae that's underneath on the ice itself. Who feeds on those diatoms? Who feeds on that sea ice are the krill. I don't know if you can see this, but this krill has a very full tummy of that golden brown colored ice algae. And this is a picture of them underneath the ice feeding on the ice algae on the underneath side of the ice. So the krill are very important herbivores who feed on the phytoplankton or the ice algae. And then of course, here's some more herbivores and other kinds of zooplankton that live in the water and feed. You can all see that they have lots of green tummies. They're feeding very happily on those sea ice algae. And here's just some more krill. So who eats all the krill? One of my favorite animals loves krill. This is an Adelie penguin, and we get to see lots of Adelie penguins when we go to the Antarctic, because that's where they live, and they're very happy on the sea ice and feeding on the krill. Okay, so now I'm going to the Arctic. This is looking at some pictures from the Arctic. Krill and sea ice algae are also important in the Arctic, maybe even more important in some places. And again, we have krill growing on the sea ice algae. These are little Arctic cod living underneath in little layers of ice, protected from their predator, which is the seals. Seals like to hunt the Arctic cod. And of course, seals are food for polar bears. And polar bears with their cubs are very common sights in the Arctic when you're doing work there. It's actually really fun to see polar bears. Walrus don't eat krill so much as they eat the animals that live on the bottom, that grow on the ice algae that falls to the seafloor and feeds them there. And the Arctic is very shallow, so lots of animals live on the muddy bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Here's just another picture of those animals that are very tightly dependent on the sea ice algae productivity. You also get blooms in the water itself near the ice. We call those phytoplankton. And so this whole ecosystem is very rich and diverse. Lots and lots of animals live in the Arctic in association with the sea ice and the sea ice algae. So I mentioned that word Pallinha a minute ago. As the sea ice melts away normally in the summertime, you get these open water areas. Kind of looks like Lake Tahoe from the air, if you've ever flown over, or some of the other lakes you can fly over in the wintertime. Lots of steam coming off the ocean into the cold air. And there's one that I studied here off of Greenland called the North Water. There's one on the other side of Greenland, and then there's a big one in the Antarctic that I've been working on. And these Pallinhas are hotspots for biology. And we've been studying them now for probably 20, 25 years, wondering if they might be models of the future Arctic as we melt the sea ice back more, or at least are they harbingers of change? Because they are growing. The number of Pallinhas in the world is increasing. So we've been studying them to try to understand how they work. What we do know is that they're very important for lots of seabirds. Some birds, like the Arctic tern, actually fly from all the way from the North Pole to the South Pole every year to be able to feed in the really high productive waters of Pallinhas in the Arctic and then in the Antarctic. And lots of animals like the puffin and the razorbills, these are all Arctic Pallinha animals. They live in the cliffs and they feed in the open water down below. There's lots of gulls. Again, I wanted to show you some of the diversity of the animals here. Probably you've seen seagulls around if you've ever gone to the seashore. But the Arctic gulls are different. There's one called the Ross's gull that's pink. There's one called the ivory gull that is pure white. Sabines looks a lot like a laughing gull, so maybe you've seen one like this. But this is called a fulmar. A fulmar is actually kind of closely related to an albatross. It has a very good sniffer for its nose or its bill. It can smell open water from miles and miles and miles away. And so if it knows that there's an opening in the ocean, like a small Pallinha opening up, it can smell it really good. And they come straight away to feed, because all these birds feed on zooplankton, or those krill that I told you about. And they can only access those krill if there's a little bit of open water for them to do that. Of course, we also have whales, belugas and narwhals. The belugas like open water of Pallinhas. The narwhals tend to favor heavier ice conditions. They're small. They don't have a beak, really. They have one tooth. The narwhal horn is actually a tooth that grows out of the male's mouth. Only the males have the horns. And they like to dive deep as well. Here's just some more pictures. We have some belugas at the Georgia Aquarium if you ever get a chance to see them. I've seen from a helicopter. You don't usually see them from a ship because the ship makes too much noise. There's also walruses. These walruses like to live on the edge of the Pallinhas and feed in the open water. They dive down, they leave their pups sitting on the sea ice, and then they jump off and feed in the sediments below, all the clams and mussels that are growing because of the sea ice algae that's fallen to the seafloor. And they're fun to watch. So you can sometimes see them sleeping, just floating their head in the water. Of course, the water is warmer than the air most times, and so when they're cold, they actually go down into the water to get warm. You often see a big male off by himself, and then a harem of females and pups hanging out nearby. Polar bears. So polar bears, well, until I met penguins, polar bears were my favorite animal. They're beautiful. They're very nice to see from a ship because you don't have to worry. The Arctic has polar bears and other predators on top of the ice. And so most of the seals will jump in the water if they see any motion or anything on the ice, because most of the hunters are on top of the ice. That's not true for the Antarctic. The Antarctic, The seals, like I showed you before, will jump out of the water onto the ice because all of the predators are in the ocean. It's kind of an interesting contrast, and it helps keep it straight. Who's who and where's where, what's what. Anyway, polar bears are amazing. They have hollow hair that transmits sunlight down to their dark colored skin that absorbs that radiation really well and keeps them warm. The worst thing you can do to a polar bear is chase it because it will overheat very quickly. And so it's good to leave them alone if you can. Oh, and how much does it need to eat? That's always a fun fact. So a polar bear needs an average of about 4 pounds of fat per day to survive. So it needs about 1 ring seal, which is about 120 pounds per week to sustain itself, a little more if it's nursing a cub. So you see all those Discovery Channel shows where the polar bear does not succeed in catching the seal, and the seal gets away, and you say, hooray for the seal, but they just need to catch 1 every week to make their way.
Dr. Yager, there's a question related to the polar bears.
Oh, okay, great.
Do polar bears have any natural predators, or are they at the top of the food chain?
They're pretty much the top predator. Of course, if there's a wounded bear or he's sick or something, scavengers and things will come after it, but nothing will hunt other than humans. Polar bears, they are the top predator for sure.
Thank you. I do have some other questions, but we'll wait until the end for those.
Oh, okay. Okay. So why do we call polar bears marine mammals? It's because they can swim. They have adaptations for living in the ocean that their terrestrial relatives do not have. They can swim, first of all. They have very fat, thick padded front feet that are like paddles. I don't know if maybe you've been on the swim team or you've seen swim teams practice. They put those big paddles on their arms, and then they tie their feet behind them so they don't flutter kick. So bears do the same. They leave their rear legs just kind of dangling behind them as rudders, and they completely swim by pulling with their front paws because they're like very big fat paddles. They can also close their nose underwater without pinching. They just their nostrils just close when they go underwater. So wouldn't that be nice? So they have some adaptations, like I say, that allow them to swim up to 100 kilometers. They don't go down very deep. They don't dive deep. They just stay about maybe 10 feet below the surface. They don't go very deep into the ocean. They don't dive down to the bottom like the walrus do, for example. But they're pretty good swimmers. But they're used to swimming in very calm waters. One of the reasons I loved going to the Arctic as an oceanographer is you don't get very seasick because the ocean is very calm. The sea ice kind of absorbs the wind, and you don't get really big waves. At least you didn't used to in the Arctic. Now there's more waves, and that's actually causing some problems for the polar bears. So this was the first Pallinha that I worked on. This is Greenland. This is a satellite image of sea ice in this open blue area. So it's quite a large area called the Northeast Water because it's in Northeast Greenland. And it's a Pallinha that we were studying in the 90s when I was still a graduate student. And this is another satellite image of the open, dark. See how dark the water is compared to the white ice. And again, once the little dark area starts to open up, then the ocean warms and it melts all the rest of the ice. This was pretty early in the season. And this is where I saw my very first polar bear on my 30th birthday. So that now you can calculate how old I am, in 1993. And it was amazing to see this polar bear taking advantage of these very high productive Pallinhas. Unfortunately, this is an image of the same coast of Greenland a couple of years ago. This Pallinha is completely gone. It exists no more. The sea ice has completely melted away. The only sea ice in the region is now flowing out of the Arctic Ocean through Fram Strait into the Atlantic, where it then melts. So there is no more Pallinha here, and I'm assuming there are no more polar bears there either, which is very sad. So what's happening? So the warm air is causing some of the ice to melt. And then when some of the ice melts, there's more open water, and then more heat is being absorbed into the Arctic, and the Arctic Ocean itself is warming up, making it harder for sea ice to come back in the wintertime. So even though it's still quite cold there in the winter, the ocean has absorbed a lot of extra heat that is preventing sea ice from getting very thick or growing very well in the wintertime. And so the sea ice cover has been declining quite a bit over the last 20, 25, 30 years. And you can see this red line is the summer minimum for sea ice from like the 80s, 1980s, 1970s. And this is what it was this past September. Actually, this is 2019. Sorry, I haven't got the 2020 image in here. So the sea ice in the summertime is much, much smaller than it used to be, which means that the Arctic Ocean is getting much, much warmer than it used to be. And of course, that's a little bit of a problem for all those animals I just told you about. And it's causing the ecosystem to shift. So remember, I told you about some of the animals requiring the sea ice. Some of the animals feed in the water, and some of the animals feed on the seafloor bottom. And what we're seeing is a shift to more animals that are feeding in the water, and fewer that depend on the sea ice, and fewer that depend on the bottom. And so the bowhead whale is doing really well, or it has been doing really well, much better than we thought it would be doing, because it's a planktivore. It feeds on open water phytoplankton. It doesn't really depend on the ice for anything. It just lives in the open water, and it's doing quite well. The gray whale, however, that depends on, it feeds by taking up a big scoop of sediment from the seafloor that's full of living things like shrimp and stuff. And it's having to change where it feeds. It's moved its feeding habits to the further north to follow the sea ice edge. But it's running out of food. There's not as much food here for it. And so it's actually started, they've been observing it feeding in the water column, competing with the bowhead instead. So the thing about climate change is that there are winners and losers. And we're working on trying to figure out which animals are going to do better. Many of the animals that live in the northern part of the Pacific Ocean are moving into the Arctic to take advantage of the warmer waters and lack of sea ice. And so we expect there to be plenty of life in the Arctic. It's just not going to be the same life that we're used to. So what about glaciers? I talked about glacial ice. Glacial ice is also melting. We've been working in the Antarctic in a place called the Dotson Ice Shelf that's about 750 feet thick. And I put some, I don't know if you can see them, they're kind of tiny. This is a Statue of Liberty, and this is a Tower of Pisa. So the 150 feet or so of the Dotson Ice Shelf that's above the waterline is about the height of the Tower of Pisa, or just shorter than the Statue of Liberty. Below the waterline, so you've heard about, the tip of the iceberg. So an ice shelf is the same way. A good fraction of it is below the waterline. And in fact, there's two Statues of Liberty. Statue of Liberty is about 300 feet high below the waterline. So you can imagine if I was sending an instrument down through the water right next to this ice shelf, it would be right next to the ice for another 600 feet below the surface. So this is very, very thick ice. And when a piece breaks off and makes an iceberg, those icebergs can be as big as a city block, or even bigger sometimes. So what's happening with glacial ice? It too is melting. Part of the reason it's melting is because the air is warmer. Another part of the reason, though, and we figured this out working in this part of Antarctica, is that the ocean is warming, and the ocean is increasingly delivering that heat to underneath the ice shelf and causing the ice shelf to melt from below. And so we are losing a lot of Antarctic glacial ice as well as Greenland glacial ice. Greenland is melting a couple of different ways. It's melting partly from the surface, but it's also got a couple of glaciers that are feeling the warm ocean water from underneath as well, particularly these two here on the East Coast. So we're melting them from both the top and the bottom, and that's a problem. It's a lot of water coming off. So this is just a graph of the amount of ice coming off of This one part of Antarctica, this is just looking at the western part, the western Antarctic ice shelf. And it's in gigatons per year. So we're looking at a couple of different glaciers here. The Thwaites is the one that the United States and the United Kingdom are working together on to try to understand why it's melting so fast. This is the amount of ice over the last 30 years. It's gone from about 60 gigatons per year to about 120. So it's doubled the rate of melting. Let me sort of explain. A gigaton is a billion metric tons. And a metric ton is about 2,000 pounds. It's a little bit different from a US ton, but it's close enough. So if you need to think in gigatons, I don't know if you can, but a male African elephant is about 6 or 7 metric tons. Does that help you understand what a metric ton is? So a gigaton is 100 million African elephants. That's a lot of water coming off of West Antarctica into the ocean. And of course, oh, here's another example. I remember I threw this in. If you took the whole National Mall, so maybe you've been to Washington, D.C., the whole National Mall between the Capitol and the Washington Monument, filled it up, it's 370 acres. You covered it up with ice to a height 10 times as high as the Washington Monument. That would be 1 gigaton of ice. So now, remember, we're talking hundreds of gigatons of ice coming off of West Antarctica only every year. And 360 gigatons of ice, if you distribute it over the globe, raises sea level 1 millimeter. So we're contributing to the rise of sea level. And if you look at what's happening on all these Antarctic and Greenland glaciers, how much sea level rise is still available, we're looking at meters or multiple feet of sea ice potential if these glaciers continue to melt so fast. And of course, that has impacts on coastal communities. Here's a summary of how much sea level rise has been measured. So far, it's only been about 4 inches since the 70s, but it's increasing, of course. And I put this in here to remind me, when you melt sea ice, it doesn't affect sea level. Sea ice is like an ice cube floating in your drink. And maybe you've tried this experiment where you fill up your glass with ice and think it's going to overflow when the ice melts, but it doesn't because it's balanced. So try this at home if you want. Put a big ice cube that's looks like it's over the rim of a glass, and then watch it melt, and it will just not change the sea level at all. But glacial ice, which is sitting on land, gets added to the bathtub, if you will. It gets added to the ocean where, oops, there was my cat again, added to the ocean and raising sea level. So places like where I live, coastal, well, I don't live in coastal Georgia, but where I work is coastal Georgia. Anywhere around the coast of the United States is vulnerable to this rise in sea level. I also wanted to say glaciers melting impact more than sea level. I have a project working with this group of other scientists looking at how the meltwater pouring off of Greenland into the ocean is affecting the ecosystem. And that's really interesting project. Again, winners and losers. Some things are going to do better and some things are going to do worse. And the coastal Greenland is really important because there's a lot of people that live there. Not so many people live in the Antarctic besides scientists. So the people that live in the Arctic, places like Greenland and Canada, are concerned about how this melting water is going to affect the food web. And this is just a cartoon that we made. As that water comes down from the Greenland glaciers and comes into the ocean, sometimes it's turbid and it blocks the light for the phytoplankton. Sometimes it's clear. And in that case, it actually helps the phytoplankton because it keeps them in the sunlight for longer than they would be if it wasn't there. So there's some interesting, again, winners and losers. Oh, and here's just a satellite view off of Greenland. We think this was a bloom of phytoplankton triggered by the meltwater coming off of Greenland. Okay, so I've told you a lot about the ecosystem. I don't like to give talks about climate change and not end with something about what can we do. So there's 2 kinds of things we can do. One is called mitigation. Mitigation, again, a big word, but it means fix the problem, figure out what the source of the problem is and actually solve it. And that involves putting up less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The other thing is adaptation, or adapting to the climate change already in the pipeline, thinking about how do we help the fishers who live off the coast of Greenland, which other kinds of fish can they catch, how do we help the people that live on the coast to adapt to the sea level rise. And so this, we used to kind of ignore this part because we kept hoping we could solve the problem just by doing the first part. But in fact, we are in line for quite a bit of climate change already. And there's more coming that we're not going to be able to stop, even if we stopped blowing CO2 up into the atmosphere today. So we have a lot of folks working on adaptation as well, how to help communities handle climate change. So how do we solve the first one? The two biggest sources of CO2 are fossil fuels used for energy or electricity. So we need to switch to solar and wind, and also conserve electricity. We could get a large part of the way there if we just conserved, turned things off at night, turned off extra lights, and didn't use as much energy as, we don't waste energy. Transportation is another really big one. Taking public transportation is really helpful, riding your bike to school, taking buses and bikes and trains if you can do it, flying less, fewer flights, fewer next day deliveries from Amazon. Air freight is a huge contributor to climate change. So using more people power. If you're interested in this, how do we solve mitigation? I encourage you to check out Drawdown, which is a group of people coming up with the top 100 solutions for drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. It's a great resource. Includes things like educating girls, which would help solve some of the issues with climate, believe it or not. Here in Georgia, I'm involved with something called the Georgia Climate Project, where we're looking at solutions here in Georgia. And there's something called Drawdown Georgia, which is the first statewide drawdown project. And they're looking at specific issues that Georgia can do to mitigate climate change. And I think I'll end there. I hope I have left some time for questions.
We have some questions here in the chat as well as on YouTube. I'll start with the ones in the chat. What should I study in high school and college to become an oceanographer?
So that's awesome. I didn't even know you could be an oceanographer when I was in college. And so first of all, you don't have to study anything in high school, and you can still become an oceanographer like me, even once you get to college. But okay, so oceanography is really interesting in the sense that it's a very interdisciplinary science. You can be a biologist and want to study the krill or study the seals or study the whales, but if you don't understand the ocean, you're not going to understand your animals. And so a lot of biological oceanographers also have to understand some physics, so physical oceanography, how the water moves. It also helps to know a little chemistry, because the chemistry in the water determines whether the sea ice algae can bloom. So it's good to kind of be diverse. Take good math. Math is always good. Take as much science as you can, and don't just go down one track of science, but try to take lots of different kinds of science. If you have access to a meteorology or atmospheric science class, or environmental science. I know there's AP Environmental, which is supposed to be pretty good. If you can get into that, or maybe there's a teacher in your high school who does like how to do research. Some schools have research programs, and you can partner with a nearby university to get involved in collecting data and doing research. Any kind of experience like that will help you. But if you don't have access to those kinds of experiences, you can still do it once you get to college.
Okay, another question here says, where have you gotten to travel as an oceanographer?
Oh, that's the best part. So of course, getting to the Arctic means you go through either Alaska. I've been to Alaska quite a few times, or through Europe. So to get to the northeast water off the coast of Greenland, I actually went through Denmark and Norway. So I've seen a lot of Scandinavia, Germany, Northern Europe mostly. And then when you go to the Antarctic, of course, you go through Chile, Argentina, or in my case, once we went through Uruguay to get on a ship to go to the Antarctic. And then you come home often through New Zealand or Australia. So I have been a very fortunate woman to be able to go so many interesting places. The other thing about polar research is there are so many international collaborations. So I was in Korea last year before COVID to learn to collaborate with some Korean scientists who just have a fairly new icebreaker, and they're looking for collaboration. So interesting thing about polar science is all the different countries, especially in the Antarctic, are very interested. And so you meet a lot of folks from all over the world. It's wonderful.
As a scientist, what percentage of your time is spent out in the field conducting investigations?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish it was 100%, but of course you have to come home and analyze your samples and then write up your papers to publish so you can share your insights with everyone else. And then I'm also a professor, so I do teach. So I would say, well, some years, there were a few years not too long ago when I was at sea for probably 4 months of the year. That was a little hard. I had 3 different projects going on, and my family kind of missed me. I was raising 2 boys, and my husband helped and took over the boys for that time when I was gone. It was really amazing. So it helps to have a support system, have a good spouse who helps. So in the craziest times, I was gone at sea for about 4 months, but that's hard to maintain for very long. I would love it if it was about 1 month a year consistently. And it's usually not that much. It's usually like a month every other year or so. These are big logistics expeditions, and it takes a while to plan them.
Yes. Okay, next question. Just wanted to check what I heard. Polar bears and penguins don't live in the same place?
No, they do not. Penguins live in the south. So this is a really good question. A lot of people get confused. They don't share any space together. In fact, some people have suggested we move polar bears to the Antarctic so they have a place to live, and that would be a terrible idea because nothing in the Antarctic is used to having any predators on the ice. It's one of the reasons you can sit on the ice and the penguins will walk right up to you because they're curious and totally unafraid. It's one of the reasons you can study seals very easily in the Antarctic because the seals will sit on the ice and watch you walk towards them and basically will say, hello, what are you doing here? I had the opportunity to work with some amazing seal biologists from Sweden on one of my cruises to the Antarctic, and they took me out there with them one day, and it's really extraordinary. The seals are totally not afraid. They just got close to the seal, comforted it with a cover so it wouldn't be frightened once we started. They were sampling different parts of the animal, not hurting it, but studying it, collecting some hair and things like that. Anyway, the seal was just like totally fine with that. They talked about they're doing the similar kind of work up in the Arctic, and they said it's impossible because the seals are so afraid of everything on the surface because the bears are up on the ice and the top predator is out there. So it's very much harder to study seals in the Arctic. So penguins are preyed upon by things like leopard seals and orcas who are in the water. And so they're totally safe on land and curious. So it's wonderful, actually.
Here's another question. Thank you. Another question. Walruses are big, and you said they live in a big group. They must need to live, hold on a second. They must need to live in an area that has a lot of food. Do walrus groups fight each other for the food?
So I'm not a walrus expert, so I'll try not to say something that's not supported by evidence. So in my observations, the females and the pups are all together, and there's one male off by himself. And he defends those females and pups as his. So the only fighting I think I've seen is between males fighting over domination or dominance of the harems. So what's happening now, though, is as the sea ice gets further and further from the shallow waters on the shelf near, say, the coast of Canada or coast of Alaska, where the walrus are used to feeding. Remember that red line on the sea ice map? That was right near the edge of the continental shelf where the feeding was good. And so the walrus are used to being able to sit on the ice, jump off, leave their pups on the ice and feed right below, and then come right back. And as the sea ice margin is moving further and further north, they can't do that as easily because now the water is very deep underneath the ice. And so the mamas have to swim back to the shallower water to feed. And in the process, they're losing track of their pups. So there's been a lot of lost pups found that get separated from their mamas. So as a result, a lot of the walruses are now moving onto land. And so they're fighting for space more than they're fighting for food. They're trying to have these large groups on the beaches instead of on the sea ice. And so that's causing crowding. So I think it's more of a space issue than a food issue at this point. That's my understanding. Does that answer your question? I think there's still enough food for the walrus. It's more of a space, like where do they raise their pups without losing them or squishing them, as often happens when they're really crowded on the land beaches.
Thank you, Dr. Yager. Here's another question. Is there a way to volunteer to go on a polar expedition? And if so, how old do you have to be?
How old? So I think you have to be at least 18 to get on a research vessel. I have seen one scientist bring his daughter as his research assistant, but I'm certain she was at least 18. So it's hard to get on a polar vessel. Even scientists who have great ideas to do work, there aren't very many research vessels available. And so, especially right now with COVID, everybody's been delayed because the ship time has been really hard to get. So let's see, in terms of volunteering, not that I know of, but the Polar Trek program would let your teacher volunteer, and he or she would get paid to go on the ship with scientists. So you might get some access that way. Or, find a polar scientist and join them as their research assistant. That would be the way to do it. It might be easier to not get on a ship. You might work with someone who goes to the Arctic would be easier because you don't always have to get on a big ship. Whereas to go to the Antarctic, you have to get on one of these big ships.
Today is the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. As a young girl, did you have an interest in science? And if so, at what age did you start to develop that interest?
So when I was young, and my parents were not academics, what smart girls did was either go into medicine or go into teaching. And I thought medicine was pretty cool. I wanted to help people. So from the time I was about 5 years old or maybe 8 years old, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor. And so I studied hard and took a lot of biology classes and went off to college planning to be a medical doctor. And so that trained me well, because when I got to college and I met all the other people that wanted to be doctors, and I took the first few classes and I realized I wasn't as excited about that as I thought I was. So that's when I turned my head to natural science instead of medical science. I didn't even know you could be a medical scientist, a natural scientist. I didn't even know what that was. I didn't even watch Cousteau or those kinds of things when I was a kid too much. We went to the beach and I loved the beach, but I just didn't know you could be a scientist for a living, right? I came from my dad was a businessman, and we didn't really know what scientists did. So I think if you're if you're creative and bright and you have opportunities to get involved in your community, either, monitoring coastal waters or lakes or something, or streams, everybody's got a stream nearby somewhere. If you can get involved in some natural science, that's a good way to become an oceanographer or work your way into that kind of environmental science. So for me, I don't remember ever being told I could be a scientist. There weren't a lot of famous women scientists that we were told about. Now we sort of know that there were more than we heard about, which is really great to find out that there were a lot of more women scientists out there than we were told.
And that's why we appreciate you coming today and sharing this with us, so that we can maybe spark some ideas in the minds of the young girls that are watching today.
I hope so.
And
It's a lot of fun.
Yes.
And young men.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Do we have any other questions for Dr. Yager? I'll give it a minute to check the one online and the one here. And the one online lags a little bit. Oh, let's see. Okay. How often do you look for patterns to help you in your studies?
Oh, that's a really good question. I look for patterns all the time. That's how we come up with hypotheses. So when you're sort of taught the scientific method in school, it usually starts with the hypothesis, right? But how do you know what your hypothesis is if you don't go out and observe and see what you see and see how it works and look for patterns? And then that's what really triggers the hypothesis building, which you can then design experiments or measurements to go test. So exactly what you just described is what we do every day. We observe, especially in a field like marine science, where we don't know very much about the ocean, it turns out. We're still really on the frontier of understanding how the ocean works, especially in the climate change era. So we just make a lot of observations, and then we look for patterns to design some hypotheses for how we think it works, and then go test those. Yeah, so good question.
And you probably at that point look for cause and effect.
Correct. Right. Because correlation does not, what's the phrase? Correlation does not mean causation. But you can, if you find some correlations between some things, you can go look for how they're connected and what the process is exactly.
It seems like there's another question here. Oh, it's a comment. Thank you so much.
This was fun.
Let me check online again, see if we've got anything else. Let's see. Well, I think that answers all of the questions that we've had. And we thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully you spark something with our young people today.
Well, and please contact me. I don't know if my email is available on the website or not, but if it's not, I'm Patricia Yager at University of Georgia. So you can just Google me and find my email. Please reach out if you're interested, especially if you're interested in maybe if you're nearby and want to do some research projects or anything like that, or you need help mentoring where you want to go to college, please just reach out. I'm happy to talk to you.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.